Let's come back. Let's come back to vibronic coupling. This is a kind of avant-garde little textbook that one would find 30 years ago. 1984. Is at the University of Tel Aviv. And by 2014, we're moving rapidly. But we're moving on a basis that has a very deep root. Not a tap root, but an interpenetrating root ball. It's like giant sequoia trees do not have tap roots. Their root structure fans out so that when you have a grove of sequoia trees, they're all interrooted. And when you have something like the Western Sierras, a whole swath of many hundreds of miles is an indivisible underground kingdom of sequoia rootedness. And on the redwood coast of California, you also have another swath of that. It's very much imitated in Cameron's film Avatar, of all the plants on Pandora having their roots intertwined. It actually happens in the Sierra Nevada and on the redwood coast in California. That's why it's called California, the Golden State. It's the alchemical state. For those like myself who learn to meditate in the Sierra Nevada, my ashram was Sequoia National Park. And my sangha was the giant sequoias. Vibronic coupling. In the text, one comes to sections as one would with a physics and engineering textbook. Section 4, transition intensity, and 4.2, Born-Oppenheimer approximation and calculation of vibrational transition intensities. That's Max Born and Robert J. Oppenheimer. And by the time you get to vibronic coupling calculations in chapter 6, 6.5, breakdown of Born-Oppenheimer approximation, so that one can see that there is a development that happens that is open-ended. That was even 30 years ago. And now we're visioning deep into the 21st century, because the future extends its capacity as the new past begins its recalibration. It's like combing out the snarls from the dead past and revivifying it into a new past, which is vibrant, which has the continuity to convey that energy, that time energy, into the future, so that when one is working with very large time forms like civilization, now you can work with something that is visionarily possible, because the new past has freed up the dammed up energy of the dead past and allowed for that consciousness to be differentially freed. That's how you get to the stars. In the last 6 or 7 billion years, every civilization that has become interstellar has gone that way. we too, if we can stop being stopped. Just last week, it was 45 years since anyone has left low Earth orbit. 45 years, not even into high Earth orbit, much less the moon, much less the rest of the star system. The stop has got to stop. And the way in which that visionary future is opened is the new past needs to be combed through so that one is ready to go, because the energy, the time energy is there, because time forms of civilization, like anything else in the universe, civilizations in their time form have to transform, because the old time forms are used up. The energy has moved on. And if you cling to the dead, you're going to die. Thomas Jefferson had a phrase that he used in Latin because he was corresponding at the time with James Madison about very classic things. It translates into English. He kept saying over and over again, "The world belongs to the living." We are surrounded by the waking dead, by the zombies, by the vampires, by cloned, drone, alien surrogates, by daydreams of artificial intelligence. Enough already. Dark matter and dark energy are even more than 95% of the universe. The dark matter is able to generate the integral of gravity because space itself is a dark matter. It's a matter. There is such a thing as the frame of space dragging. Yes, predicted by Einstein. Yes, confirmed about a decade or so ago. Over really powerful gravitational centers, like stars, very close up, very minutely calibrated, or like really powerful things like neutron stars that don't take that fine a calibration because it's quite apparent. Space itself, like an old film running through a projector, when the shutter is dirty and thus interrupted, it will shutter, and you'll get this, used to get this image of the projector shuttering and the film is jumping around, and if it jumps too much it'll crack and burn. Space itself is a matter, a dark matter. And its emergence is because the dark energy dynamic of time is at once the signal trigger of the whole integral. That's why it's time bound. The time bind of the universe is so colossal that it literally doesn't matter very much. To the Indian mind, once it had the ability to utilize Nagarjuna and other developments that came out of it, one began to speak in terms of kalpas, of time forms that were enormous. Hundreds of millions of years. The beauty of a quality that is there in a Nagarjuna has only been recognizable recently as in this presentation, to have a very deep root in India, black India, original India. The development of archaeology in India really began about the 1920s, right after the First World War, and the development of archaeology in the Indus civilization, the Indus River complex, with two great cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, going back well over 1,000, almost 1,500 years before the so-called Aryan invasion, which was not an invasion at all, about 1500 BC. In Sir Mortimer Wheeler's great little book, now in the third edition, almost fourth edition of the Indus civilization, this is the archaeological reconstruction of the great granary complex in Harappa. Each one of these very long granaries done out of an indigenous kind of a concrete, out of additives and mixtures with the mud, so-called. They're not just mud bricks. These mud bricks form the walls of the city of Harappa, which are still archaeologically solid almost 4,000 years, 700 years later. These walls, out of these mud bricks in Harappa, were standing this large by at least 2800 BC, 4,800 years ago. And the prototype for them was there several thousand years before that. You can store enough grain in Harappa, and Mohenjo-Daro was even larger, because they didn't need all that food, but they needed the trade that was based upon it, and that trade was extended by about 2300 BC by contact with somebody they could do business with even further to the west, and that was Sargon of Akkad. He took the Sumerian city-states. By that time, by Sargon's time, there were 42 of them, scattered, each one saying, we're the best, we have our own gods, we have our own version. You push us, we'll kick you. Sargon said, that's not it. We have a chance for everyone to live enormously better, not just a little better, but enormously better, because we have not only things that other people want, we have now, I have developed caravan techniques and routes and a way to deal with other kinds of people indefinitely. And we have a little something called bakshish. Later on it was called bakshish, to make it easier, and that is we have the metallurgy, which nobody has, and that is how to utilize a very rare metal that only occurs in a few places, large enough deposits so that one can mine it and have it, and that is tin. And tin by itself is tin. It's not very good. But when you add a little bit of tin to copper, which is very prevalent, you get bronze. And bronze is hard enough that unlike copper, it will take a point and an edge. Later on, some 2,000 years later, they would understand that you could take a little bit of lead and add it to the bronze and make pewter. It's really strong. Doesn't take an edge so much as bronze does, but you can make pots and vases that cups that are still around. Sargon developed huge caravans of onagers, not camels, onagers. Onagers are black-haired mules. They're the classic Semitic ass. And the symbol for Semites in those days, 4,400 years ago, was the onager, the black-haired. To say donkey is a misnomer. They were tough, wiry beasts of burden, and you could have hundreds of them in long caravans and have them stored Pony Express style all along leeways, and those were self-sufficient little stations because they got along with the local populations because they were the station which the railroad ran through, and everybody got to trade with everybody else. What do you need? Give us your list, and we'll find it somewhere along this way, and we'll bring yours back at the same time that we go on and give other people. And all of this happened within one lifetime. The major way in which it happened is because his daughter, he had two sons, they were really courageous warrior type sons. But the daughter was incredibly intelligent, and she became the world's first named published author, Enheduanna. She knit all of the 42 different temple city groups together into this tapestry, this akkad, where they shared a reverence for the same goddess, for Inanna, the moon goddess. And what was related to the moon goddess was the moon god in Egypt. The moon god who was related was Thoth, the developer of writing. But Thoth had a partner named Seshet, and Seshet was the goddess who was taking Thoth's writing and being able to write whatever she wanted on the leaves of a special laurel tree called the Persea tree, so rare that they only had one place where it grew, and that was in the courtyard at Heliopolis. And if Seshet writes your name after you have died and gone through the weighing of your heart, not your mind, if your heart was not heavier than the plume of an ostrich in the scales, then you were able to be purified with language. Language that would take you through 12 hoops of guardians at gates that stopped those that couldn't. Utilize language in that way, because language is the synthesizing dynamic of civilization. And you can't get born again until you are able to utilize enough of a poetic to get you through those 12 gates of the netherworld, so that you can rise the next day with Ra, with the sun. Sure as the sun rising. But when Seshet writes your name of someone who has gone through those gates, has that language dynamic, is able to be inscribed on the Persea tree, and when your name is on the leaf of the tree of life, you are eternal. You can rise every day into eternity. Not just be reborn tomorrow morning, permanently real. So that the wisdom of the goddess is to eternalize the courageous penetration of the god, who together then are able to mature something. And in Mohenjo-Daro, south of Harappa, about 400 miles, about the distance between San Francisco and Los Angeles, they had a great bath next to not just a palace, but a whole civic structure, like Harappa had, Mohenjo-Daro had. And this is like the Great Bath, archaeologically found in Mohenjo-Daro. When Nagarjuna built the complex at Nagarjuna Khanda, he designed a special tank. And this is the tank that was found there. They had to find this at Nagarjuna Khanda because progress being what it is, even in India, they were building a huge dam across the Krishna River. If you've ever driven along the Columbia River Gorge between Oregon and Washington State, you realize that about every 30 miles or so, there's a huge dam. Produces incredible amounts of electricity. There's no flooding downstream, downriver. Nagarjuna Sagar is one of the world's great huge dams. But it does something like the dam on the Colorado River by making Lake Mead the Hoover Dam, some 75 stories tall, backing up the Colorado River. In India, Nagarjuna Sagar backed up the Krishna River so that it was going to flood all of the lowlands around, leaving Nagarjuna Hill as an island in this immense lake. And in that immense lake was all the ancient archaeological building, ruins, foundations that go all the way back to Nagarjuna's time. And before, because that valley, that area, had been inhabited by ancient India people since the Stone Age. Went back to Paleolithic origins. India was populated by people working together back 40, 40,000, 50,000 years ago. Similar people to those who were leaving Africa about 50,000 years ago and going over the little strait at the end of the Red Sea into South Arabia, or going into the north, going across that little isthmus that leads to what is today Israel and Palestine and points beyond. If you go to Mount Carmel on the coast by Haifa, at the top you will find, and it has been found, burial sites of Neanderthal man, going back about 200,000 years. One of the coffins, one of the burial sites of Neanderthals, great Russian-American historian Rostovtsev found that the bones of the Neanderthal were surrounded by little black things, and they found that they were the seeds of flowers, that the body of the Neanderthal had been outlined in flowers for the burial. If you go down the slopes of Mount Carmel to the valley area, you will find caves, and in the caves were found Homo sapiens sapiens skeletons going back 40,000 years. If you go along that valley, you go through a rift that leads eventually through a pass of the last mountainous ridges, and you come out to where the Sea of Galilee is. And where that passageway comes out and meets the shore of the Sea of Galilee, that's where Mary Magdalene was born. Right there. This pond, this tank, was built by Nagarjuna because he came many thousands of years after Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, and he was in contact with the Prajnaparamita left by the development of St. Thomas in India. Listen up now. This is true. This tank is a baptismal tank. It has an architecture which is recognizable to anyone who can go beyond counting. It has 8 different levels, 8 different phases. Is that not familiar? And it has an alternate where they are 2 persons per side who come together going down a step, and then they go split apart, and then they come back together, then they split apart, and all 4 of the sides come down until one has the quaternary angles where one has pairs, but they're pairs from 2 that have split off from a pair, come together to make a new pair, and so at the very end you have the 8 that are able to come together in the square that is left there. That is the square of attention of initiation, that you have been baptized to have life eternal, guaranteed by the literate goddess paired with the penetrating God, who together are able to use the language exactly perfect so that this happens. And one of the outcomes 1,000 years after Nagarjuna was Naropa, whose baptismal document is translated into English in this particular volume that we have talked about several times. If you look at a dancing goddess from Mohenjo-Daro, you will find her at Nagarjunakonda again dancing with her pair. Because that dance is not just a dance of life, it is a dance of eternity found. More next week.